and I was brought on board here at the Climate Reality Canada as campaign coordinator last year to help climate reality leaders like yourselves take part in the federal government's town hall discussions. And following our release of the only report to basically tell Canadians what happened at those discussions, and meetings with all five federal parties to discuss the findings, we went back to the drawing board to craft the next logical step in light of the international political headwinds that we're now facing, to put it mildly. And after 3 months of preparation, I'm very excited, as we all are, about the campaign that we're launching internally today. Climate Community Hubs, or Carrefour Climatique Communautaire pour nos collègues francophones. Today's webinar will be exclusively in English, but future webinars will be sometimes bilingual and sometimes exclusively in French, depending on who we have joining us to give the talks. Briefly, hubs are local focused, they are citizen-led, and they seek to develop broad-based consensus around priorities for greenhouse gas reductions at the local level. They draw on the momentum of nearly 100 community town halls that we held last year as part of that consultation process across the country, and over 1,200 other initiatives that are happening in cities across Canada that our fabulous interns, Roland and Elena, have mapped out in municipalities from coast to coast to coast. Hubs, the purpose is really to rally diverse voices, not only to establish greenhouse gas reduction targets, but also to support their implementation. Benchmarking the hubs against each other eventually, what we'd like to have is some friendly competition happening across the country and opening opportunities for collaboration on policies, policy solutions at even provincial and federal levels once we get, hubs talking to each other from one province and another province. At this point, it'd be nice to tell you to sit back. We've done this before, and just follow the manual and everything's gonna be fine. But the reality is that this campaign is born of a convergence of political, economic, and technological developments that make it feasible for the first time. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but suffice it to say that pushing the frontiers means channeling your entrepreneurial spirit as climate reality leaders, taking risks and stepping out into the unknown with full confidence that this transition is inevitable, and it's a matter of time, and building community and camaraderie among our network will be the cornerstone of this initiative's success. When you look at how many other organizations exist nationally to act on climate, there are very few that have a national mandate like we do and have a very specific mandate around the issue of climate. So we are stepping into this role as knowing that we are one of the key organizations that needs to play this role across the country. And the 700 of you are really the key to its success. So before we get to our guest of honor, I should mention that the conversations have already begun with the phase 1 launch cities that are Vancouver, Calgary, Saskatoon, Toronto, Vaudreuil-Soulanges, and Montreal. And we're aiming to have 20 such hubs active by the end of the year. To get involved, we're going to give you some more information afterwards, and but you can also feel free to reach out to any of the staff, and we'd be happy to point you in the right direction as we continue developing the campaign towards the April 20th public launch. Before we get to our guest of honor, I would like to invite my colleague Eddie Perez, our leadership core coordinator and our international policy expert, to say a few words about how this campaign fits into the international context. So,
hi, Matt.
Hi, Eddie.
Yes. How's it going? Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen right here. And all right, Matt, can you see it? Just want to confirm.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Great. So I just want to give a bit of context in 3 to 5 minutes presentation on the importance of this campaign within the international mechanism and the context of climate change politics and climate change governance. And when you look at the notes that were written by the chair of the IPCC, everything that we're doing today with this campaign fits specifically on the work that the IPCC is doing and everything that is related to the negotiations within the UNFCCC. So I call this small presentation, the IPCC and the importance of cities in the international mechanism. On the current context, at the IPCC level, there is a clear interaction between climate change, urban development, and use and human well-being. What this means is that right now, the reports that are going to be written for the next years, the next report that will be launched and public in 2022 will be about climate change and urban development. Actually, as you may know, 70% of global fossil fuel comes from urban areas. And the working group number 2, the co-chairs of this working group are agreeing that 21st century will be the century of the cities. It will be an environmental, social, and economic transformative power of cities because they and their structure will determine how people will live, what are the infrastructure needs, adaptation needs, and how do we build resilience within cities. Actually, the sixth report of the IPCC will integrate more cities and mitigation and adaptation opportunities, regional issues, and will focus also on human settlement. What this means is also that there's going to be a new research that began in AR 5 on modeling and what are the types of modelization that can help us assess and evaluate climate change in regional aspects. This was a challenge in the last report, but it is something that is being developed as we speak today. And the scope of these meetings are being discussed as the IPCC works on the 3 main reports that I'm going to show you after. So some facts and considerations, I gave some on the last slide, but 54% of the world population are in urban areas. This is a fact from 2014. It may have changed, but if we continue as we go right now, 66% in 2050 would live in urban area, and 90% of this increase is going to happen in Asia and Africa. The IPCC agrees that climate change can happen through local action. So I'm just, this is all logical because if many more people live there and energy consumption is happening in cities, the solutions can also come from cities. And mitigation and adaptation solutions should happen locally. Adaptation opportunities must be linked with mitigation opportunities. Building resilience, but also trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions need to go hand to hand. And it's part of the project that we're developing today. But there's also a geopolitical context that we have to consider. I just want to mention some of these very important moments that are happening right now. We're talking, for example, about the Sustainable Development Goals. And there is a need right now to focus on regional information, more policy relevant, regional downscaled information that can help us know a bit more about how Sustainable Development Goals and IPCC objectives are aligned within the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And I just want to mention that we have a climate leader that is working right now in this project, which is Steve Lee, and he's here with us, I think. And the Sustainable Development Goals are also linked to things related to climate finance and eradication of poverty, which is also linked to Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Another important moment is the UN Habitat discussion that happened last year in the fall. The IPCC agrees that we must focus on regional climate change effects. This is a challenge for the IR6, but will eventually be worked out by the scientists that will work in this report. Habitat 3 presents also the concept of cities for all, which means inclusion, which means discussions about eradication of poverty, and also the integration of more cities and mitigations and adaptation opportunities based on regional issues and also on human settlement. Another big important moment that we cannot forget is the Paris Agreement. As I said, there is going to be a need to speak about the Article 2 of the Convention, which also include the eradication of poverty, which also include important things like, for example, the 2 degrees target and aiming for 1.5. The IR6 and the IPCC also speak about the cross-sectoral objective. Cross-sectoral objective means that not only nations' needs must be put forward, but also subnational needs must be put forward. And when we speak about cross-sectoral aspects, we're also talking about regional aspects. We're also talking about indigenous needs. We're also talking about other kind of needs that were not as specific as they were in the fifth report, and are going to be more enhanced in the fifth report. The sixth report will also needs also to be aligned with past reports, and with the two special reports that are being worked right now, which is 1.5, how to live in a world in 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is going to be publicized on 2018, reports on oceans and acidification for 2019, and there's another one in 2019 that will speak about land use, desertification, land, food security for 2019. And then, of course, the big report in 2022 before the global stocktake, which is where we're going to assess the evolution of all this. My last in just a couple of seconds here, my last slide, it is a time for us in cities to show more ambition. And I think this is where this project comes in. Climate Community Hub are aligned with international projects and associated to the IPCC and the UNFCCC. Community Climate Hub seek to support implementation of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Community Milestones, the Compact of Mayor, and C40 cities. And in all of these opportunities, we have seen cities showing leadership. Cities in Canada need to play a bigger role when it comes to the Pan-Canadian Framework for Climate Change. This is something that we have been talking with our allies, and within the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, there needs to be an opportunity for us to push Canada to show more ambition in the international mechanism on topics like infrastructure, green finance, and opportunities for more adaptation and mitigation and building resilience. When we speak about transportation, when we speak about energy consumption, these are important issues that when we speak about them and try to enhance ambition within them, we're also affecting other evolutions within the international mechanism, because we're not the only ones asking these questions. We have more than 150 countries asking the same kind of questions. Thank you.
Ready? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So I have the honor of introducing our panelists. I have the best job today, I think, out of all of us. And it's really an honor for me to introduce Andrea, because we've been in touch many, many times over the past couple of years. And the reason for that is that Andrea is actually a trained climate leader. She got trained in 2008 in Montreal. That's among many, many other things and involvements. So just to give you an idea, Andrea is a Vancouver councillor, and she's led the City of Vancouver's award-winning efforts to be the greenest city in the world by 2020. She was absolutely instrumental in Vancouver becoming the first major city in North America to commit to 100% renewable energy. She was actually elected in Vancouver in 2008 with Mayor Robertson, and she was Vancouver's first permanent deputy mayor. Currently, she runs the city's Policy and Strategic Priorities Committee, and she's also appointed to Metro Vancouver Regional District Board, where she serves as the Vice Chair of the Climate Action Committee, and she's a member of the Regional Planning Committee. At the national level, she sits on the Green Municipal Fund Council, which awards federal dollars to green infrastructure projects. Before she was elected, she ran the largest membership-based environments group in Canada. She's won a number of notable awards, including the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal and the World Green Building Council Chairman's Award. And yes, of course, last but not least, she's part of the great Climate Reality family. And it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce her today and to pass the microphone over to her for her presentation. Do we still have Andrea? Oh, I think Andrea has switched to viewer mode right now. So we're actually missing Andrea. Do we still have?
Yeah, she's been promoted to panelist, so she'll be back on the panel in just a moment.
Excellent. So we should have her in the next couple of seconds.
I think she's here.
Yes.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay! All right, thank you, Audrey. I appreciate that introduction. You know, it's funny, this is actually my second webinar today that I've been speaking on, and the first one went so well at a very early hour this morning here, but this one I've been more challenged by, so I apologize. So I'm just going to start this up. Can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Okay, let me just go back. Share screen. Share screen. There we go. So now, can you see the slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Reimer. You heard about me, so I won't tell you much more about me other than to say it's a pleasure to join you all today. As Audrey noted, I'm a councillor in the city of Vancouver. That's our waterfront here in Vancouver. So that's one of the reasons that I was asked to speak to you. And also, I'm an Al Gore presenter. I actually was trained in January 2007 back in Nashville. So it's been 11 years now since I've been trained. And we were like the first 50 that went through, and it was definitely a work in progress. So I was asked to do a few things today. One was to speak about why local action matters, as well as how you prepare the groundwork if you're in a city that's not Vancouver or who's somewhere along the spectrum towards becoming a greener city. And we're looking at the opportunities that exist to do that, as well as challenges that Vancouver is experiencing, and that would be reasonable challenges to anticipate in other cities. So I thought what I would do is put the first two together, why local action matters and how you prepare the groundwork, because I think it's part of one sort of cohesive story that hopefully will fit together for you as I go through it, and then at the end speak to some of the challenges we're still experiencing. So the greenest city, the concept of being the greenest city in the world by the year 2020 was established by the city of Vancouver in the year 2009. It was not our only goal. We have quite a number of what we call big, hairy challenges here. In addition, in early 2009, when we were elected, we had, in addition to what we call the voluntary goals, we had the involuntary goal, which was a commitment and obligation to put on the Olympics in 2010. Also to note that in late 2008, there was a global recession that hit, and we were also dealing with the impacts of that, as was everywhere else in the developed world. So it didn't exist as the only priority in Vancouver, or I would say even the one that demanded the most attention. The Olympics are sort of like a toddler that need constant attention. And then we have a number of other challenges, including homelessness, that have a very latent need associated with them. So I'm going to talk to you about what I would consider the four critical ingredients for why Green a City has been so successful for the city of Vancouver. I would say, because I'm guessing like me, many of you have many issues that you care deeply about, that these four ingredients are not specific to Green a City. They, I would argue, are essential ingredients on any number of things that you might be working on, from ending poverty to increasing women's gender equity, reconciliation, whatever it is. So the first key ingredient is leadership. This is our mayor, Gregor Robertson. That's our city hall. It's actually a day, I think this is actually from early March 2009. So it gives you a sense of what it looks like outside my window today. Leadership really matters. I come from a sort of anarchist political tradition. I would love to believe that distributed leadership and lack of hierarchies and all these things actually are the way that the world runs best. The reality is that is not the world we live in. And if the person with the capital letter beside their name, the prime minister, the premier, the mayor, is not also demonstrating the leadership, transformative change is very, very challenging. It's not to say you can't get incremental change, and we've had many city councillors in Vancouver who've been leaders in their own right on different aspects of green policy, but it's very important that the person who the public perceives as the leader is also leading. So I would say that if you live in a city where you don't have a mayor who's doing that, my question to you is, How do you convince the mayor to get invested in it, or how do you convince someone who is invested in it to run for mayor in your next election? The next thing I would speak to is having a plan. And I know this seems so obvious, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in many planning process, but a couple key things to think about. We have a saying that some is not a number and soon is not a time. So the plan that we developed has a very clear set of measurable goals. We have 17 targets across 10 policy areas, which I'll get to in a minute. They were pulled together in the Greenest City Action Team, which you'll see there on the left side, was established in 2009. They were tasked with coming up with those targets. It was not a question that we put to public consultation, and I will say very simply that the environment doesn't really care how the public feels about it. If your goal is to come up with meaningful action on climate change, it is not an exercise for public consultation. It's an exercise for experts to tell you what the actual bottom line are. We did do public engagement, and I will explain that in a bit, but not on the question of what the targets would be. So we have these targets across the 10 areas, as I said. They're all interrelated. You can't really get to one without the other. So for example, the carbon goals, it would be impossible to reach that goal for climate by 2020 without also reaching the 4 goals that you see, the 2 under buildings and the 2 under transportation. Zero waste is a goal that relates to carbon, but it also relates to healthy ecosystems. So as we divert waste from going to landfill or incinerator, we both protect the air, water quality, but we also make sure that trees that might otherwise have been cut down are not, because we're reusing that resource, or mines that might otherwise need to have pull out resources are not doing that because we're dealing with it. There's also 2 cross-cutting goals. As noted, this whole effort was undertaken starting when a recession was happening. So green economy, if it didn't work for the economy, it didn't work. So we had 2 goals related to doubling the number of green jobs, as well as doubling the number of companies that are greening their operations. And the last goal, the lighter footprint, relates to making sure that we're not externalizing all these greenhouse gases and water and waste and all the other things. So it uses an ecological footprint measure that was developed out of the University of British Columbia that basically calculates how many planets it would take to support your city. So in our case, it would take a little over 3 planets if everybody on planet Earth lived the way that we did. Obviously, we only have 1 planet, so our goal there is to, by 2020, get down to 33%, but by 2050, because we also have long-term goals, to get down to 1 planet, because that's the one we've got. So we talked about 2 of the 4 ingredients, leadership as well as having a plan. I would also note that the 17 metrics across the 10 areas, we report out on those every year. It's mandated to happen before July because, again, you can't fool the environment, so there's no point fooling yourself. You should really be clear about where you're at. And if you're not doing so well at something, that shouldn't be embarrassing. It should be an opportunity to collaborate with people in the community to find another way to go about it. So the third of the 4 ingredients I wanted to talk to is action. So it is so easy to write a plan relative to actually getting people to act on it. So in the case of our planning exercise, we started in 2009 with the establishment of the Greenest City Action Team. But before they even started writing those targets that I spoke to earlier, they actually had a task that came before that, and that was to come up with a set of quick starts, things that we could get going on right away. The basic impetus for this is that, well, I would say there's 2 types of people in the world: those that like to talk about, those that like to think about things, and those that like to do things. I happen to fall into the doing category, so it was a bit just about my personality. I'm the mayor's lead on the Greenest City, so I understand why we need to put the time into thinking carefully about things, but I feel better about the work I'm doing if I can do stuff and see results every day. And there's many people who feel the way I do, and I felt they too would like to see some actions happening. So before we even started on writing a plan, we started acting. So in the 20 months between starting writing the plan and bringing it to council, we actually had 84 separate initiatives that were undertaken. Some of them were very high profile, and I'm sure you've heard about them right across the country, such as the bike lanes. hugely controversial, but the reality is they cost less than 1/10 of 1% of a capital budget for the year. The maintenance costs on them are so small, I can't even put them in a line item relative to the street beside it. And every single year, this bike lane means that 2 million trips that would otherwise have been taken by cars are now not being taken on the road next to it. So hugely successful. Things that have been not controversial at all, but actually much more expensive and with good benefit are things like deploying electric vehicle network. We now have the largest electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Canada and continue to grow that out. We just adopted a new electric vehicle ecosystem report that looks at the long-term future of electric vehicles. Waste has been a huge issue for us. We've gone from about 50% diversion. We're now coming up on 75% diversion and on track to meet 80%. That includes things like diverting organic compost, but it also looks at houses and buildings, which are a major source both of the volume and the mass of the waste that we get in Vancouver. So we've established a deconstruction program that is able to divert 94% of the waste that used to be created from buildings is now going into either reuse or, where that becomes impossible, recycling of the materials. We also have done a lot of work on water. We've seen an 18% reduction in the amount of water that we're using. If you've been here in winter, you probably think that's not that really important because we have a lot of water in winter. But the reality is, even before climate change, we have 4 to 6 months every summer that are drought months. And with climate change and increasingly erratic climate, the severity of those droughts is getting to the point where it's become a major drain on our infrastructure and our budget. So it's important to do. We've also looked at reestablishing local food production. So we have upwards of 6,000 community garden plots now. Vancouver, if you haven't been here, is actually a fairly small city. We have about 700,000 people living in the city, another 300,000 who come to work in the city, so about 1 million people in the city each day. But our land area is only 115 square kilometers. So it means that every inch of land is fairly well fought over, which is why urban agriculture seemed like it would be a challenge for us. But we're actually now at the point where we have 21 functioning commercial farms in the city of Vancouver, including this one right outside of our downtown core. We also have done a lot of work around access to nature, urban forestry. This one's interesting to me because originally when we set the goal, we set it at 150,000 trees to be planted, new trees, over the course of 10 years. We quickly realized, and I'm happy to tell you this story if you're interested in the questions and answers, but realized through a rather almost comical moment that when you're just counting quantity, it's possible that people can't see the forest for the trees, so to speak, and decide to take out larger trees in order to put in smaller trees. So we changed the goal. Actually, it's the only goal area we've changed substantially, where we've moved from number of trees to canopy cover, because it's really the quality of the urban forest is what matters to us, and figured out ways to engage the public, because the vast majority of those trees are going to come on private land. So having the public assist in keeping them alive is important. As I mentioned, green jobs is a big part of our plan, and looking at how we double those jobs. We've been fairly successful in it. So most people, when they think of green jobs, think of tech and what that looks like. The reality is that most green jobs look like this. They're jobs that involve hard hats and reflective vests, and these guys clean toxins out of water. They don't have a lot of toxic water in Vancouver to clean. They work primarily up in the oil sands or in other industrial sites across Canada and the US. But the reason that they've chosen to locate their business and the jobs associated with it in Vancouver is because they see the opportunity there for brand alignment. So we're now at 5% of all jobs in Vancouver are green jobs. It's a 19% increase since 2010. We're just updating the numbers this year. And as you can see from the donut graph on the left side of the screen, all of those areas that we've seen the green job growth in are areas that we've invested good policy development into, and a major reason that businesses end up locating in Vancouver. As a result of that, Vancouver, our economy is growing at a rate of 3 to 1 of other cities in Canada, and is one of the fastest growing economies in the developed world. One could argue that's not good. It definitely has negative consequences on the city, but if there's people who tell you that you can't both grow the economy and be green, I would tell them that they are absolutely wrong about that. So I did say earlier that I would talk a bit about public engagement. So as I mentioned, the targets that we chose were not chosen from public opinion, but rather by scientists that had answers about where we needed to be by 2020 to be the greenest city in the world. We did, however, once we passed those targets, ask people, how should we get to these targets? Because that is a legitimate question to be asking the public, because they're the ones who are going to have to do the work. And as many of you probably know, cities have extraordinarily tiny legislative jurisdiction in Canada and even lower fiscal capacity. So if we're not figuring out what people want to do, I mean, put another way, you can build the bike lane, you can put in the compost bin, you can build a new rapid transit line if you're lucky and can find all the money to do it, but you cannot force people to take those. The federal government could legislate that you take it, like must do something. Cities have bylaws, which are not the same as full laws. So in Vancouver, for example, we can't even ban a plastic bag. Well, our province that we're in can, but we can't. So we have to find ways for people to want to do things, and the best way to have them want to do it is for them to write the plan themselves, which is exactly how it went. Over the course of the plan, we actually had 35,000 residents, so about 5% of our total residents, as well as 180 organizations that represented more than half of the people who live and work in Vancouver, involved in some aspect of writing the plan. In fact, the first day that we opened up the consultation process to the public, we booked a room for 300 and it sold out. Then we booked a room for 500. And when I say sold out, we actually sold tickets to it, to remind you that it was in the middle of a recession. And we had to have even public consultation had to break even. It seems crazy now that we charge people $10, but even at that, we ended up selling out the largest venue in the city of Vancouver, other than the hockey arena. And still had 1,000 people on the waiting list. That's how interested people were. And one of the reasons that they was because we had been acting. So no matter how you felt about the Greenest City Action Plan, whether you were totally in favor or totally opposed, you were absolutely convinced that we were going to act, because we already had, as you heard earlier, been putting in bike lanes and gardens and all sorts of things that people were had strong opinions about. So they wanted to come out and be heard as part of that. What was important to us wasn't just that they came or that they talked to each other. This is the intermission, but very importantly, that we figured out how to get in touch with them, because who we really wanted to talk to was the people that they knew. Because those 2,500 people that came out to that first meeting, I think they would have found us if we were on top of a mountain at 2 a.m, right? Like really what we wanted to know was, who are the 20,000, the 200,000, the 2 million people living in the region who aren't going to make it to these meetings? How do we go talk to you? So in this picture, for example, the woman in the middle came to the original event that was held at the theater. And these are some friends that she brought out to a community garden. But the deal we made with the public is, if you can get 10 people or more in one place, we'll come and listen to your ideas about greenest cities. So I was at bowling alleys, soccer games, churches, labor picnics, like you name it. I was there to hear how people felt. One of our goals, of course, was to get people to go to a website, but we didn't just ask them to go, we asked them to participate. They could put their ideas for what they felt should be in the plan alongside the ideas of David Suzuki was one of the Greenest City Action Team members, the mayor of Vancouver. This is actually like day one of the website, so you don't get a good sense of it. But we honored that anything that won the votes, we would put as priorities in the plan. And that may seem a bit crazy and not usually the way governments do things. But back to that rationale that if we need them to actually do these things, then why not fund and support and resource the things people want to do? And I think it's been one of the reasons the plan has been so successful. It also means that on any given day in the city of Vancouver, the city itself may have 84 separate initiatives that it's doing, but these blue dots represent hundreds of actions that residents and organizations are also undertaking to mobilize the greenest city goals. And it's why we've been so successful. Of the targets, we've already met 3 of the 17 targets. We met one of them, the mode share, the 50% walking, biking, or taking transit. We'd already met that by 2015 and continue to grow that. As you can see, vehicle kilometers driven per capita and building greenhouse gases, again, met, and we're starting to exceed now. We don't just want to stop when we reach the target. One of the things that I wanted to note was the greenhouse gases, as you can see there, are at 15% reduction since 2009. Consider that that happened when we had by far the fastest growing economy in Canada and a corresponding population increase. So it's really about 22% per person reduction in greenhouse gases. Vancouver's now at 3.9 tons per person. And if you want to think about it in a national context, that happened at a time when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. So we had not only no help nationally, but actually often hostile responses from the national government. And at the same time, you saw Toronto is at 7.2 tons per person, so almost twice what we are. And Calgary is at 17.9 tons per person. So it gives you a good sense of why cities matter, what's possible to do with cities. So given all that, then, you might wonder why we decided to up the ante last year, or I guess 2015, so 2 years ago, by also establishing a target of 100% renewable energy mandate. So what I would say is that Vancouver, the atmosphere it doesn't hand out gold stars just because you're doing great work at lowering your carbon emissions. You're just as susceptible as everyone else to impacts. This is a picture of downtown Vancouver, or what would otherwise be downtown Vancouver, except that it's blotted out by smoke from forest fires. In June 2015, those forest fires aren't that close to the city. They're upwards of 50, 60, 70, in some cases several hundred kilometers away. But they were so pervasive and so persistent that the city itself didn't see blue sky for close to 2 weeks. We also have the misfortune of being the western terminus for the pipeline from Alberta and have a federal government 4,000 kilometers away who's addicted to those revenues and doesn't seem to understand that they're asking Vancouver and our region to absorb an incredible amount of economic, health, and environmental risks with zero benefit for anyone locally. And certainly, even if there were jobs to be had, there's less than 30 to be had, but even if there were jobs, the impact on us from having all that oil burnt, as you saw in the previous picture, well negates any of the benefits. So in 2015, March 2015, we made a commitment to shift to 100% renewable energy for our city from all sources. And when I say city, I mean small c, all of the people living in Vancouver. It may seem a bit impossible, but it's not. Consider that 31% of our energy is already renewable. Even half of our public transit is moving already on electric energy, and our electric energy is primarily renewable energy. So people, when they think about renewable energy, often think of solar panels and exciting, sort of sexy new energy projects. The reality is that by far and away, most new energy in the future is going to come by reducing energy use. So energy efficiency is essentially the energy of the future. It would be impossible for us to replace kilojoule for kilojoule every kilojoule of conventional energy now with renewable energy in the future. Impossible, maybe not, but it would be such a huge financial and logistics burden that we're not sure how one would do it. But if we reduced our energy use, which is very high, relatively speaking, and then replace it, what you would see is buildings like this. So this is the building that those solar panels that I showed you earlier on. So it's really the envelope of this building that is the big difference in between whether or not we're going to make it to renewable energy by 2050 or not. So we anticipate that we will see a 70% population increase in Vancouver by 2050, but we'll actually go from 79.3 gigajoules of energy use to 38.3 million gigajoules. Really the challenge here, though, is how you deal with all these new buildings is one thing, but how you deal with all of this, which is our existing building stock. Some of that will involve district energies. The reason I showed you this building up at the front of the presentation was to show it to you again at the end and to say that it's an existing building at Science World in Vancouver that was moved over to this district energy system, which draws energy off of sewage and hot water in the city. And if there's one resource that I can guarantee you is renewable, it is sewage and hot water in a city the size of Vancouver. So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was the challenges of moving over, and hopefully if your city is a little further along, this is helpful to know. So this one this headline I love because, well, it's super funny in the context of the United States right now. I could actually see this being a headline that came out of our tweet, at least, that came out of the president. And to say that there's so many alternative facts out there right now and so many competing storylines about what is happening with the climate. Apparently, the president's chief of staff just yesterday made a comment that average global temperatures are the lowest they've ever been this last year, and gee, why isn't anyone talking about that, without understanding that global warming and climate change are interrelated concepts, but that climate change doesn't always mean that every day will be warmer than the next. So one of the big challenges we have is those who want to put out alternative facts or not factual information seem quite emboldened to do it. Those that have the factual information are either totally overloaded or don't feel empowered or don't have the time to fight with the trolls online. A second challenge, I would say, is a bit of protest fatigue. There's been, particularly this last number of months since the US election, it's just very challenging for people to keep coming out. And I also think it's the same phenomenon nationally, but we have it here in Vancouver. People think we're on top of it, right? And while we are ideologically aligned and want to see action on it, we also need the public to come out and say that they would like to see action on it. I know that might seem a bit disconnected, but elections can't be the only time that you participate in democracy in a 4-year stretch. So figuring out how we work effectively with civil society. We've had some, back to those alternative facts, we've had our local natural gas company increasingly putting a bit of a garbled storyline there about renewable energy out to the public, which is not entirely factual. But in the absence of effective messaging from civil society, it just becomes us versus the natural gas company, and people aren't sure who to believe. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, there are actual technical challenges. I will say in the renewable city strategy, it's the first time I've passed an aspirational target and not been sure that we could meet it. But as it turns out, 95% of it is completely doable on the timeline that we set. The 5% that isn't is commercial transport, but consider that we have 35 years to do it. I would also say nobody on earth would have a child if you had to have a fully costed plan for that child for its entire lifetime, plus legal, financial, and risk management strategies for its entire lifetime. So, have a reasonable idea over the next number of years, but understand that most things that are worth doing based on a values proposition are going to have some ambiguity, especially as the future stretches out. So the key is how we're working towards that. The last point I wanted to make, Flint, Michigan, which is near Detroit. Flint, Michigan owned the 20th century. Even though, and the 20th century being the age of the automobile, they had no steel, no coal, and no oil, which were the three most critical ingredients of the 20th century. What they did have was Billy Durant. So Billy Durant owned a horse and buggy company. It was the largest on the continent. In 1906, had the largest domestic production of carriages that had ever existed on planet Earth. In 1908, he took $1 million and put it, which was a lot of money back then, and put it into a new company called General Motors. Everyone thought he was crazy, that these things would never catch on, but by the end of the Depression, every single one of his competitors was gone, and he, at that point, owned the largest company on the planet, the largest company that existed for almost 100 years until the tech companies showed up. So the point to make here is that we can wait to find out who the next Billy Durant is, or we can be the Billy Durant. And in Vancouver's case, we believe very strongly that we don't want to wait to find out what the future does to us. We want to create that future. And we're really grateful to have people like you who are there to create it with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think I can speak for all of us when I say that was inspiring, uplifting, and genuinely funny at times. So I'd like to remind everybody that I'm just going to give a brief, maybe 2-minute overview of what this could look like in your communities. While I'm doing that, I'm going to ask some kind of participation from all of you. The chat there allows you to ask questions. Alex is asking a question in the Q&A section, and in about 3 minutes, we're going to jump to those questions and we're going to answer a few of them. Some of you also left questions on the registration on the registration documents. We've noted those, and if we don't have live questions here, we'll address some of them that came out of the registration questions. The other thing, if you don't have a question, then I have a question for you. So you can fill in the poll that I'm about to launch right now, and when you do, that's going to help us, and this just kind of underlines what this is about, this internal launch right now. The purpose of it is for us to get a good idea what you're facing in your reality. Not everybody's reality is the Vancouver reality of, hometown of Suzuki and hometown of Greenpeace. And, you've got a good chunk of people of the population willing to move in that direction. So in the case you don't have that reality, this poll that we're launching, the calls that we've been holding with cities, the 6 cities that I mentioned previously, this gives us an idea of how to refine the campaign as we move towards the public launch on April 20th. So your input is very appreciated. I already see that we have people filling in the poll, so thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen very briefly to give you an idea of what happened in Montreal and how we think that it could serve as it could be instructive for what is happening in other, what could happen in your city. So if I can, I will just stop that one and start this one. Okay, not sure if I am, voila. Okay. So in Montreal, we asked this question, and in the poll, you'll see a similar question. And what we'd like to propose through this Community Climate Hub campaign in your city, in your community, is to ask a similar question. And it's easy to draw people together. And as Andrea mentioned, elections can't be the only time that people participate in their democracy. I could go into a number of the other wonderful quotes that she left. Can't fool the environment, so don't fool yourself. Or some's not a number and soon's not a time. I'm definitely gonna be borrowing some of those as the campaign develops. So thank you, Andrea. But in Montreal, what we did is we said, we need to reach those unreached people, the people who are, not the 35,000 that show up, but rather everybody else who doesn't necessarily take the issue to heart. So one of the things we did, let me see if I can, there we go, is put together a coalition of organization. And this is the real call to action of today's call. If I can sum it up in a sentence, it is, let's figure out who's active locally on climate in your community. We're going to add them to a map similar to the map that Andrea showed you earlier. We already have a map of 1,200 initiatives that we've identified here at the office, but we are not capable of doing the kind of community investigation that you guys are on the ground in your own communities. So the objective will be to put that map together and then basically say, okay, in our community, how can we reduce, what's the how? And what we did, and Andrea mentioned that being as a key element of getting citizen feedback into the process. How can we reduce the emissions? Because it really is the citizens and the enterprises that will be involved in the transition. So we need their support. And that's what we've realized in Montreal. We brought together 36 communities as a kind of like a beta test. And what we'd like to see happen now is the same kind of public support coming from a diversity of people groups towards the implementation of climate targets. So yeah, we held a consultation with 3,500 people. So not 5% of the Montreal population, which is a very impressive target. We put out segmented communications to say, hey, if you're a Buddhist, or if you're a cyclist, or if you're a student, why do you care about this issue, and how could it impact, how could it improve your life? What are the co-benefits that improve your life? So because I really want to allow time for conversation, and because this isn't the end of the conversation, but rather a continuation of the calls that have already taken place and of the interactions that I hope we have, the office, with the climate reality leaders on the ground across the country for the rest of this campaign. So I won't get too much into the details of how this could happen, but I did want to mention kind of like what we're proposing is based on precedent, and it is also based on financing that is now available through the federal government, a little bit more of a propitious climate for taking climate action. So at that, I will pass it over to Eddie, and I will ask him to moderate some of the questions that you guys have left. Thanks so much.
All right. So thank you, everyone. We have a couple of questions here. There have been some, and thank you, Andrea, for answering all these calls, all these questions. There's one here from, I'm just gonna read the one from Ken, who just, sorry, no, I'm gonna read the one from Alex Jordan. I'm just gonna ask Andrea to just share her response publicly to everyone. Just read the three first questions so we can have Andrea's answer here recorded. So the first one is, do greenhouse gas emissions per capita calculations take into account the emissions of people living outside Vancouver but working in Vancouver? The second one is, as Vancouver economy grows and draws more jobs to the region, it also means that towns in the greater Vancouver area might see their population increase. What is the instance of these towns with respects to managing climate change? And a third one, I'm gonna leave the floor to Andrea afterwards so she can answer. Here is, can you say a word about how you got the business community to support bike lanes in Vancouver? Thank you. Andrea, can you just give us an answer that could maybe combine all of these three questions? Thank you.
Sure. So on the first, and generally speaking, all of the tracking we do relates to the impact that Vancouver is having. So that includes all of our residents, all of our businesses, also all of our institutions. And Vancouver hosts the vast majority of the major institutions in the greater Vancouver area. So it's a fairly substantial impact that Vancouver has to absorb. We do have in British Columbia, the provincial government mandates what are called regional districts. So I sit as a director on the Metro Vancouver Regional District. The goals of the regional district, both the legislative jurisdiction is different than the city, as well as it's a bit more like the GTA, I guess, or maybe Greater Montreal area if you think about the politics as you move out to the suburbs. Having said that, it's quite progressive, like, you know, a rising tide floats all boats, or whatever that quote is. So, and it also, there's some competitiveness. I have at times, I will admit, where I felt like Vancouver maybe wasn't moving fast enough on something. I might go talk to a colleague in another city and ask them if they'd consider moving on it. And then we'll go to my colleagues and say, do you really want to be behind this smaller other city than Vancouver? So it can be helpful to have that. In terms of the bike lanes, it's such a great example of how, I mean, every single piece of research ever done on bike lanes will tell you that it is by far and away more favorable to retail shopping districts than cars are, much more favorable. But it doesn't mean that the business community feels that's true or feels like that's going to be the outcome. So really what we found is that it's leaders within the business community that have made the most difference. So some of those leaders came as a result of, they happen to be people who are more swayed by facts than emotion, and that is actually a relatively uncommon person, so it's a tough one to depend on, but also because they experience the change over time. My favorite thing about Green a City is that back in 2009 when we first started, I would stand on stages and talk to people and try and convince them it was worthwhile doing, and people would be like, oh, that's a stupid idea and why would we do that? And now the main thing I get from people is, why aren't we there yet? And the same people who thought it was a stupid idea. So I think you just see people have changed how they feel about it over time, and that's more important than anything that we could demonstrate through research or another more empirical evidence source.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 3 minutes, so I'm just going to combine most of the questions that I have here. And thanks, Alex and G, for answering these questions. Kent is asking, I live in Vancouver. What actions are most impactful for a climate leader towards building our climate hub in this progressive city? Another question from Alexandre Plante. What is the platform that you used for the prioritization of the actions in your plan? And the third question, There's a reasonable consensus on the fact that education is a great way to build climate movement. What is Vancouver doing to imbibe its students with progressive climate values? And how are they getting children to be influential and active in their communities?
Yeah, well, let me start with that last one first. I actually, and again, I disclosed my own bias earlier. It's funny, I have a friend who says, Andrea, there's actually three kinds of people. There's people who like to think, people who like to do, and then there's people who just like to talk. So I guess if you accept that, I still am very much the doing person. So I think my own experience is the show don't tell is by far and away the biggest way to change minds. So we would still be having a very big pitched battle about bike lanes here if we wouldn't have just done it. Because at some point you just have to, you know, if you have half the people saying we want it and half saying they don't, but everybody creating theoretical ideas about what might happen, you just have to do it to see what actually will happen, and that takes some risk, right? And that's why the citizens movement, the idea of the hub model that Matthew and Eddie and others are building, is so critical, because you need that half who wants you to act out there willing to respond on it. I do think education is important, but when I go into schools now, I was elected to the school board before. When I used to go into schools 15 years ago and ask people, how did you get to school today? Where do potato chips come from? That was one of my favorite questions. Everybody would have been driven to school, and they couldn't even answer when I said potato chip that they came from potatoes. They came from a machine, the store, or my mom, right? Those were the three answers. Now when I ask, I can't shut the kids up in the school. They're like, I grow potatoes. I grow this thing and eat it. I bike to school with my mom or my dad. I walk, whatever. So I think ultimately getting people to do things, if you can, is going to leave a more lasting impact with them. In terms of the platform on the website, email me, andrea.reimer@vancouver.ca. You know, I realized as I was reading your question how long it's been that I can't remember what it is. And this last question that I'm reading on the screen, I'll do just before I sign off. The thought on the waste collection in apartment and condos, it is so, re-engineering the composting system of a city is the second hardest thing I have ever done in my life. And I had no idea at the beginning how challenging it was going to be. One of the best ideas we got came from, one of the things we did was give out these things called small green small grants. So you gave between $100 and $500 to people in the community to just try stuff, to put in a bike rack, to have a bee workshop, to do a workshop on bulk buying or setting up a tool library or whatever it was. So this one woman, for $200, she came up with this solution where she bought this green ribbon and she knocked on people's doors who have single family houses and asked them if they'd be willing to have people who live in apartments nearby to come and drop their green waste in their bin. And if they did, would they put this green ribbon on? And so all of the engineers in the city of Vancouver did not come up with the solution. And this woman did, and it was so brilliant. I mean, we've since rolled out a much like a bigger program, but as an interim step to show what the demand is, it was super simple and incredibly brilliant, and built social capacity as well as environmental capacity. And that's when you see the magic start to happen.
All right, thank you to Andrea. So the key ask from this call is to help us develop a map of allies in your community by submitting potential allies to this database from your local hub. Please use the link that has been shared in the discussion. Thank you for all the questions. I'm gonna let Matthew continue as we move forward.
Thank you very much. We're going to close up shop, but the poll results are there. We are going to broadcast those by email, as we are the link that was shared in the comments. The questions that haven't been sufficiently answered, we will also address by email. And I'm very happy with the participation in today's call, and your recommendations for future webinar subjects will be appreciated. We'll be sending around a poll about that as well, so that you can let us know what kind of subjects you'd like us to address in the upcoming webinars focused on city and community action. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you so much to Andrea, to Eddie, to Audrey. And to Roland, who you haven't seen, but he's our intern here at the office, who's taking notes, and those notes will be available, as will this video, to everybody on the call. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful Monday afternoon and evening. See you soon.